The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us today for the 6th webinar in our series, We Believe Experiences Matter. My name is Bob Schumacher, and I'm Managing Director at User Centric. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker. His name is Chris Nicholas of Language Technologies and ReadSmart. Chris is going to be presenting some research that demonstrates how subtle changes to word spacing and text size and line endings can substantially improve reading comprehension. Chris will introduce himself in just a minute, but I'd just like to say that I've been tracking this technology for a couple of years now, and I find it fascinating, and I hope you will too. I think this is some really revolutionary breakthroughs in how people read text. And with that, let me get to a couple of housekeeping items here. Before I hand it over, if you have any questions during the presentation, use the GoToWebinar dashboard to send them in, and our moderator, Pam, will compile them for the Q&A at the end of the presentation. She'll also be monitoring the chat window, so that if there are any technical issues, we'll try to address those as best we can during the webinar. And lastly, if you're on Twitter, please join the discussion using our hashtag UXLunch. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Chris.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank User Centric for giving me the opportunity to talk about some of the work that I've been working on for the last 10 years. A little bit about my background. I'm a neuroscientist by training, and for many years I studied the theory of how the brain perceives and interprets words and letters. For the last 10 years, I've been working at developing software to apply some of this theoretical knowledge to improve reading comprehension and more generally improve literacy. As Bob mentioned, I work at Language Technologies and our offshoot company ReadSmart, which is a service bureau to deliver the software. I also teach a course at the University of Arizona and have worked on some patents over the years. Much of the work I'm going to be talking about today is stems from Thomas Bever, who is the co-founder of the company that I work for, and he's also been a major figure in both the fields of cognitive science and in the field of psycholinguistics over the last 30 or 40 years. Many of the theoretical contributions and as well as some of the applied research that I'm going to be talking about today is from him and his colleagues. I wanted to give him a plug. The printing press was a major invention about 600 years ago, one that had a huge impact at the time, similar to the impact of the internet that we've experienced in our lifetimes. But one of the interesting things about this technology at that time, of the time, is that how remarkably conserved or conservative it is. Typography has remained largely intact with very little change in the last 600 years. And that's in spite of major changes such as digitalization, the advent of the web, and more recently the importance of mobile devices in distributing text. Despite all of these major changes, the way or the form that text is presented has largely not changed. And one of the things I want to talk about today in this presentation is ways in which we can make modifications to what we've been working with as fixed type for the last 600 years. To make type a little less fixed than it's been. An outline of what I'm going to talk about today is shown here. I'm going to give a brief overview of how reading works, discuss how phrase formatted text, the technique that we're talking about, can help in reading, and I'll go through a series of studies from the laboratory, the field, and some case studies that illustrate that the technique can have an impact, and then I'll have a summary at the end. How reading works. Here's an illustration of an eyeball showing the retina at the back of the eye. And there's a specialized structure here called the fovea, or the fovea centralis, which I'm going to talk about. The retina is the part of the eye that takes information about light from the outside world and sends it to the brain, where the brain processes what objects are and where they are in the world. This specialized structure called the fovea sees about 1 to 2 degrees of the outside world. And although this structure is only about 1% of the total surface area of the retina, In the visual cortex, this part of the retina sends its projections to about 50% of the visual cortex of the brain. The other 99% of the retina outside of the fovea is processed by the other half of the visual cortex. So there's this is a very important structure in humans for processing the outside world, and this is the part of the eye that sees information about shape, color, and texture, and the form of what things are. This is an experiment that you can do interactively with me. If you hold your arm at arm's length and have one or two fingers up, that's about the size of 2 degrees of visual arc. And it gives you a sense of what this part of the eye sees when we're reading or doing other tasks, looking around in the world. Some details about reading. Reading is made up of a series of eye movements called saccades. Between the saccades, people's gaze stops or fixates on what they're reading, and fixations typically last about 1/4 to 1/5 of a millisecond. During fixation, when the eyes are at rest, people see about 7 to 15 characters. And because in English words are about 5 to 6 letters in length, that means during a fixation people are seeing 2 to 2.5 words depending on where they're looking at a particular piece of text. Here's an example of what reading will look like in real time. I'll step through this to try to illustrate what this window looks like, this 2-degree window during reading. But before I do that, I wanted to show you what the eye movements look like. So these arcs above the text show where the eye is moving. And one of the points is that the eye is not fixating on every single word. Certain words are being skipped, like some of the prepositions and some of the determiners. And the other thing that's important is that the process isn't perfectly efficient. Occasionally there's a backtrack where people make errors and people have to make a regression to reread what they've read before if they make a mistake or have a misunderstanding, because reading takes place in real time and it's not always a perfect process. So here's an example to show what the fovea would be seeing in the 7 to 15 character window. And that includes the backtrack. So during that process, what happens is what you're seeing on the printed page, which I just illustrated through that demonstration, has to be turned into sentences and meaning. And the way that's done is through orders of processing in the brain. But years of research have shown that the unit of sentence comprehension, whether it's auditory or visual in the case of reading, is the phrase or the clause. The goal of reading is to understand what the phrasal chunks are. And this window of text of 7 to 15 characters has to somehow be processed in a way that can be turned into that understanding of what a phrase is. And then those phrases are put together to understand discourse. So that's a challenge. And we'll go into that throughout the rest of this presentation. Another detail, 1 in 6 characters is a space. These are highlighted here in red. And what this shows is that in Western languages such as English, the character is, the space character is the most frequent character that's presented. It's used to separate the words so that you can tell where one word ends and another word begins. How can text formatting help this very frequent character? Well, in ragged right text, space sizes between words are even both within and across lines. The spaces are the same size between words. And the space at the end of the line, which is called the rag, is uneven. And that's because although the margins and the page size may be fixed, the word length is variable, and so the XX space is taken up at the end of the line. In right-justified text, the sizes are even within a line, but from line to line, the size of the space is variable. But in both cases, these spaces are not particularly informative to readers. They serve the purpose of separating words, and in the case of justified text, they serve an aesthetic purpose, which is to make the evenness of the ink density similar between lines. But this sort of general uninformativeness of spaces to readers may not have always been the case. An interesting study is to take a look at the Gettysburg Address, the handwritten version. This is a version written by either Lincoln or his secretary Hayes. And I believe this is page 2. And if you select a section of the text and measure the size of the spaces in this handwritten form, you can see this overlay in type. So what we've done is measured how big the spaces are between each word, and those are shown in arbitrary units in red here between the typed words. What's important is there's a lot of variability in the size of the spaces in this handwriting, but what's interesting is that this variability is not random, it's pretty systematic. If you were to take a word processor and type out these words, but keep the spacing proportional to the number that were measured between the handwritten version, you would see something that looks a lot like this. And what you can see here is that the differences in spacing are tending to naturally chunk the words into phrases or phrasal units. And the spaces are a little bit larger between phrases and a little bit smaller within a phrase. So the claim is that this is a natural process, possibly subconscious. We don't know that the writers intentionally did this, whoever wrote this out by hand. But the idea is that if during the process of composing or copying this, the brain was naturally pausing at these phrases, which is what a lot of research has shown does happen during sentence comprehension, it would make sense that the writer might do the same thing and might give literally extra space between the phrases during the writing process. What's interesting is that word processors don't do this. If you look at the block of text on the right, what happens in word processors is that the spaces are the same size within a line, and you don't have this kind of information. It's removed or it's taken out of the processing. If you think about it, line returns are also a type of space. And if you go back to this handwritten version, what you can see is that 7 of the 11 lines begin with a new phrase. And in addition to that, only 4 lines break a phrase or interrupt a phrase. So subconsciously or consciously, this writer tended to begin lines with the beginning of a phrase and in some way avoided interrupting lines too often. There are some interruptions, but not as much as you would get as if a word processor crossed the line the way word processors naturally do it, which is just a simple word wrap. If you take the same text and allow a word processor to process it with approximately the same margins, you'll have about 50% of the lines beginning with a new phrase and about 7 of them breaking a phrase. But it's kind of random whether or not a phrase gets broken or not. It happens in some cases. It doesn't happen in other cases. So what happens if you take this technique that may occur naturally during the handwriting process and you consciously format printed typed text this way? There's a number of lab studies that have addressed this very issue over the last 40 years. But before I show you those, I want to show you what this looks like. The version on the left shows regular text, and the version on the right shows formatted text phrased with this phrase formatting technique. And the importance here is to show you that the gross structure of the document isn't changed. The margins are about the same, the pictures are in the same place, the line length and the overall structure of the text is approximately the same. There aren't any obvious differences, and that's intentional. Zooming in, you can see in a close-up here of what this text looks like in standard formatting on the top and phrase-based formatting on the bottom. And if you look closely, you can tell that certain phrases are set off where the spaces before prepositions or determiners are a little bit larger, and the spaces after those same words are a little bit smaller. And that allows this visual chunking process to be implemented in the text and the spacing. These changes are very subtle, so I've showed an overlay here. So you can see that the changes in black of the phrase formatted text are shown above changes in red, which is the standard text. And there's a lot of similarity, but there's a slight subtle shift in the actual spacing that adjusts the composition or the position of the words on the page. And by doing this technique, either as subtly as it's just been showed here, or more obvious ways of doing it, such as putting in hash marks or a slash, a number of psycholinguistic studies or psychometric studies over the years have shown that this technique can dramatically improve reading comprehension or reading speed. The graphs that are shown here and throughout this presentation will show the relative improvement of phrase formatted text above and beyond the reading comprehension of standard text. And the reading speed increase across various studies is shown on the left graph. And you can see that there's an 11 to 23% increase in reading comprehension across a variety of studies with different texts and different populations. And the same sort of result occurs if you measure reading comprehension or retention, if you ask people to answer comprehension questions after reading a passage. So when you consciously phrase format text using this technique, the published research shows that people do read faster and they tend to remember more of what they read. The following studies that I'm going to show you are based on a specific automated phrase formatted text methodology, and this is a commercial product called ReadSmart. So a number of the studies that I'll talk about involved SAT-like tests, and some of them in classroom settings. In this study, we looked at a textbook that was formatted either in regular formatting or in phrase-based formatting. And in this study, it was carefully controlled where students were matched into yoked pairs before the study based on their SAT scores. And within each yoked pair, one student in the pair was randomly assigned the phrase formatted textbook, and the other student was assigned the regular textbook. Now the students were blind to what the study was going on. All they knew is that they were getting a free textbook for the semester. And this was a computer literacy course at a community college. The results of this study were that a higher percentage of students earning honors grades occurred with people who read the phrase formatted textbook. Most of the honors grades in the class were from people who read the phrase formatted textbooks, and fewer of them came from students who read the standard textbooks. Conversely, the number of students who received either a failing grade or students who dropped out of the course were dramatically lower when the text was phrase formatted. Another interesting thing that was measured in this study was an exit poll. At the end of the course, students were asked how well they liked the textbook. And although the content was identical between the two versions, the only thing that was different was the presence of the phrase formatting or not. The students who received the phrase formatted treatment during the course rated that they liked the textbook much better than the students who received the regular textbook. So not only did students receive better grades, they enjoyed reading the book better. So phrase formatted text helps students learn more, and it also helps them enjoy their learning tools more. In another study, we examined phrase-based formatting in a Reader's Digest magazine, and this was another split design where half the people read the magazine in the regular format, and the other half of the people read the magazine article in a phrase-based formatted version. And afterwards, we asked people questions like, would you recommend this author to someone else, or would you read another article or another book by this author? And what was interesting is that there was a dramatic increase in the likability scores of how people rated the text. Again, the text content was identical. The only difference is the form that it's presented in. And there was a 38% improvement in people's subjective ratings of how well they liked the content. So phrase formatted text makes reading more enjoyable for adults. In some computerized, or some studies we did with SAT or TOEFL-like materials where people read reading comprehension passages and then asked comprehension questions afterwards, we looked at a number of studies of people who were learning English as a second language. In this first study, the students were native Chinese speakers who were learning English. And in taking a TOEFL-like test, the reading comprehension questions, the performance in the reading comprehension questions was increased by 12% above and beyond what people received as scores in the standard text format. This particular study has been published, and the image on the left is an award that this won in China for a research study on teaching in schools. In a study of native Japanese speakers on SAT-like essays, we found that there was an improvement in reading comprehension both for advanced students and basic level students, but for the less advanced students, the relative improvement between the regular text and the phrase formatted text was even greater, up to 44%, which makes a lot of sense because good readers naturally find a way to use techniques that allow them to chunk information when they're reading, and struggling readers or readers who are not necessarily strong in a second language are less able to do that. So this technique can act as a crutch to pull performance up to the level, closer to the level of good readers or more advanced readers. We also looked at a group of native Spanish speakers, or Spanish-English bilingual speakers in New York. And in this study, there was an emphasis in the instructions to emphasize accuracy and not speed. And what we found was a small but non-significant improvement in reading comprehension, but a 18% improvement that was statistically significant in reading speed. So depending on the testing conditions, this technique can either improve reading comprehension or reading speed. Reading isn't always a perfect situation and a perfect environment. In this study, we had a split design in which in one setting, the students had a quiet classroom setting, and in the other part of the experiment, an actor came into the classroom during the test and periodically opened the door and closed it loudly, went up to the test proctor and whispered loudly, and simulating a distracting condition. And what happened was that although in both cases there was an improvement from the phrase-based formatting, the improvement was even greater in the situation where there's distractions. So when conditions are less than ideal, having this sort of visual crutch built into the text can really improve comprehension when comprehension would be otherwise degraded. Similarly, if you decrease the legibility of text, such as in this experiment, where text was either photocopied once or photocopied 6 times, and this was done several years ago when the quality of photocopiers was much less good compared to what it is today. And so 6th generation photocopies were actually pretty bad in the way when this experiment was done. And even with a poor 6th generation photocopy, reading comprehension was improved above and beyond than what was found with the 1st generation copy. So even when text is made less legible, again, this technique helps lift performance to better than what it would be. So phrase formatting improves comprehension when reading is not easy, such as if you're reading in a language that's not your native one, reading while you're distracted, or if you're reading degraded print. So what's happening here? Phrase formatted text makes spaces more meaningful, and this helps readers plan their fixations more efficiently. In an eye tracking experiment where we looked at reading comprehension, we compared the eye movement patterns of poor readers to those of superior readers. This was a median split looking at above and below average readers. And the pattern of poor readers differs from that of superior readers in a number of criteria. Poor readers tend to make fewer fixations. The fixation length is different, and they also tend to make a lot of recursive or regressive readings. They backtrack a lot. What's interesting is if you compare the eye movement patterns of poor readers to those of good readers in phrase formatted text, the eye movement patterns of poor readers begin to look like those of superior readers when they're reading the phrase formatted text. So there's a physiological reason why this technique works. You're able to encourage the type of eye movement patterns that good readers have learned to do naturally. Now I'm going to talk about a few field studies that have been done. In this experiment, what we did was we looked at click-through rates on a web page ad. And in this case, the web page ad was fixed as a picture in order to prevent reflow of the text. And the standard formatting is shown on the top, and the phrase formatted text is shown on the bottom. And what we found was by imposing this technique onto the text and fixing it in the picture, this ad was able to increase click-through rates on the phrase formatted ad about 140% above what was found for the click-through rate on the standard formatting. In this study, we looked at a survey at the end of an article on, in this case, the Kindle. This was a description of a new version of the Kindle that had come out and a review of the technology. And at the end, there was a questionnaire to win a free device if people turned in the questionnaire. And what was interesting is more people turned in the survey, and there was people rated the article, whether they would send the article, found it interesting, and whether they would send it to a friend. And the subjective rating of whether they would send it to a friend was increased by 10% in the phrase formatted version compared to the standard format. In addition, there were a few questions at the end, true-false questions about what they'd read in the article, and this was a contest to win a device. And in the phrase formatted text, people answered the comprehension questions more correctly than they did in the standard text. So even for an online survey, for a newsletter, there's an effect as well. So phrase-based formatting makes content more actionable. Finally, I'd like to talk about a couple of direct mail case studies. In these studies, these were split A/B designs where the mailing list was randomized and half of the mailing list received the phrase-based formatted version, and in the other half, they received the standard formatting. And what we found is in a number of studies, totaling over 500,000 pieces of mail today, this is just a few of these case studies here, that there's an increase in response rate when the text is phrase formatted. In this case, in this particular study, a 12 or 13% increase in how often they actually respond to a solicitation. In addition to actually responding, people actually sent in larger donations. So these are nonprofit solicitations where people are asking for donations for certain causes, alumni associations or other types of mailings. And with the phrase-based formatted text, there was a 7% or 8% increase in the average gift size compared to standard formatting. So not only do people respond more often, they actually write checks for larger amounts of money. And since for this industry, the cost effectiveness of such mailings is important, one of the factors that they measure is the income per piece mailed. And that's a way of combining the two measures I mentioned before. And when you look at this, there's a 23% increase in the efficiency or the income per piece when the text is phrase formatted compared to standard formatting. Here's a second a second case study that illustrates similar results. This is a different mailing, but the same technique of a split design with half the people receiving phrase-based formatting and half the people receiving standard formatting. And what we found in this study was a 16% increase in response rate and a 3.2% increase in gift size from phrase formatting over standard formatting. And again, also the income per piece measure was much more efficient from phrase formatting compared to standard formatting. So phrase-based formatting makes direct mail much more effective. People have higher response rates, they donate larger gifts, and the income per piece is much more efficient. So what's the take-home message? Phrase formatted text results in text that is more enjoyable, it's more memorable, it's more actionable, and by measures that count, such as donating more money, you could argue that the phrase formatted text is more persuasive. So that's the end of my presentation.
Okay,
questions,
great.
I'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Chris. We do have a few questions here for you. First of all, does this work for languages besides English?
To date, the studies that I'm aware of that have been published, or the studies that we've done ourselves, have only been in English. But the technique should work fine for any language that has spaces, any Western language where spaces are between words. The concept should work.
Okay. Can the technique be used on the web or HTML? And a related question, was any testing done to compare reading online versus reading on paper?
Let's see. I'll answer the second one first. I'm not aware of any direct comparisons between reading online and reading on paper with this technique. The technique could be applied to the web. It's probably easiest to apply to the web for line endings, the line ending aspect of it, because there are easy tags in HTML to directly control that. It's a little more complicated to apply to the web in the case of applying the between word spacing. And one of the limitations for that is HTML is designed on purpose to separate out the content from the form. And generally speaking, with HTML, browsers control the composition or format of the text. There are ways that you can change individual spaces, but it begins to become burdensome because having individual tags for every single space starts to bloat the size of the HTML. And that's, in general, HTML was intended to be a lean coding format. So although it's technically possible, there are some challenges present in applying it to the web. One way to get around this is to use line breaks as the focus for short passages of text, like Google Ads. Or for pictorial ads, you can take small chunks of text and fix it into a picture form. So there are other ways to get around HTML but still present this on the web.
And in a related question, do you have any examples of how it's been used in mobile application?
Yes, we have a proprietary format that sends PDFs to mobile devices that are sized according to the display screen of the device. And so there's ways that you can fix in changes like the variable spacing so that it's built into the document on a PDF. And this can be delivered on the web or it can be delivered within an app on mobile devices. We have a publishing platform that we've developed for this, and for people who are interested in checking it out or looking at it, there are a number of free books available on our online bookstore at books.readsmart.com. The example books are a set of children's readers, but they'll illustrate how you can deliver phrase-based formatting in a fixed format to mobile devices like the iPad or the iPhone.
Another question from Paul. Do the success rates hold up across the nature of printed content? So, for example, prose versus result lists versus bulleted lists, etc.?
I don't know about differences in bullets versus long passages of text. I think in principle it should apply to very short text passages like something like an ad or a bullet, just as well as it should for long paragraph passages. But in general, the results are robust across a wide range of types of prose, such as we've tested it across anywhere from book chapters to magazine articles to newspaper articles, and things that are in between, such as SAT passages. So it does work across both a wide variety of text forms or text formats, and it also works across a wide variety of populations.
And sort of a related question, would the improvements still exist when combining ReadSmart with right justification as done by newspapers and magazines? Could you speculate on how much the improvement might be attenuated?
Sure. So I guess the one way to characterize or look at phrase-based formatting in the case of ragged right text is that it's a way of doing what we call semi-justification. So you're taking the available space that would be otherwise at the end of the line, and you're redistributing it within the line according to the phrases that are present. That same technique can be applied in the right justified setting, but what you're going to have is kind of an averaging of the justification aspect with the phrase-based information. So although you're kind of watering down the, I guess, the saliency of the relative space size because of the justification aspect, the principle still works. I mean, justified text will still benefit from phrase-based formatting. It may not benefit as much as ragged right text would. That would be my prediction. I mean, we haven't done any studies directly on this, and I'm not aware of others, but that's my guess. We have done studies on both types of text. We just haven't compared them directly within the same experiment.
So does this technique work for instructions for use for a medical device, for example?
Yes, we've applied it across, commercially we've applied it across a wide range of materials, anywhere from books, both digital and printed books, and we've also applied it to direct mail pieces, and we've also applied it to things like instructions for medical devices. So even when you have relatively small amounts of text, it still is important that those small amounts of text are read well, and any aid to reading comprehension will help people, particularly people who are either distracted or are below average readers.
And how would a practitioner change the line endings or spaces to implement this? What do you do?
Well, physically, with line endings, the way to implement it would be you could either use a paragraph return or a hard line break to control the line endings manually. And copywriters often do this either on the web or in physical print to control the appearance on line endings, at least for headings or for other specialized areas of text. But you can do this for any paragraph, short or long. In terms of controlling the size of spaces within a line, there are two ways to do it. One is you can control the width of the space. You can also control the kerning either before or after the space. Those are two physical ways of actually making these adjustments manually by hand. Of course, we also have a automated software version that's a commercial way of doing this. But for small passages of text of a few sentences or a paragraph or two, those are the ways that you would do this by hand.
Okay, and then where grammatically should the breaks be made?
They would be made where the phrases begin. So the beginning of phrases are usually things like determiners or prepositions, a or the, and you also look for things like prepositions, to and of. The critical thing would be to distinguish function words from content words, and if you're not a linguist, the way to determine that is to think about whether the word in question has any meaning. So content words like book or table have very clear meanings, but other words like of are kind of hard to define. What does of mean by itself? And those types of words, those function words like of and the and a, tend to play a special role in the syntax of the sentence. And those are the types of words that you would want to, those are the types of words that begin phrases, and those are the types of words that you would want to highlight. Highlight either by spacing or some other techniques depending on the application.
And then are there any tricks using fonts, or lowercase versus uppercase, bold versus italic, Roman, point size, things like that?
The technique should apply to equally well to any type of font or any type of text. I mean, there are differences in aside from phrase-based formatting, in, for example, uppercase characters are usually harder to read than lowercase characters. But if you have a reason for typesetting something in uppercase letters, phrase-based formatting will improve reading comprehension above and beyond the penalty to having something in all uppercase. So the technique is sort of independent of other factors that are important for reading and legibility, like font choice or the design of the document. I mean, ideally, you would have a legible font with a large X height, and you would have a comfortable line length with comfortable leading or spacing between the lines. If you've done all of those things and done phrase-based formatting on top of it, you would have the best situation for reading ergonomics. But even if you have less optimal design or less optimal font choices for whatever reason, the technique still improves reading comprehension for those. And I can say this from many of the research that we've done, for example, in direct mail studies, where a lot of the typesetting in these direct mail studies has been intentionally using fonts that aren't necessarily easy to read. And the choice is aesthetic because it results in a certain response or a certain emotional response from the readers. But we're able to achieve improvements in return rates and in donation rates, even in circumstances where the typography or the design choices are probably less than ideal. Less than ideal for reading, but of course ideal for the purposes of the direct mailer.
What's the first known use of the technology in print? So even if it wasn't ReadSmart exactly, the technique of phrase formatting.
I believe the first published studies on this were done in the 50s, the 1950s, and some of the early research was done looking at specifically having the ends of lines correspond to the ends of phrases, so that the end of a line didn't interrupt a phrase. Also in some of those studies, some of the physical techniques that were used were to introduce a hash mark, a pound sign, between phrases, or to use slashes between the phrases. And that's a technique that, aesthetically it's not very ideal for blocks of text because it kind of looks strange for what we're used to in Western typesetting. But those were some early demonstrations that the concept of highlighting or making the phrases really obvious to the reader facilitates reading comprehension. The first use of ReadSmart commercially was the book called Syntax by Andrew Carney, which was first published in 2006.
All right. The questions we weren't able to get to, I'll make sure that Chris can respond to those via email. Thank you so much, Chris, for presenting this great webinar, and thank you all for attending. The recording of the presentation will be available for on-demand viewing via YouTube and Vimeo with links from our website, usercentric.com, by tomorrow. And the slides will also be available on SlideShare. We'll tweet when that's live, and you'll also get an email noting when that's live. Our next webinar, Models and Methods for Global User Research, presented by Bob Schumacher, is May 8th. So you can register for this and future webinars from usercentric.com/webinars. Thank you again.